for a person with OCD, they will start to obsess, which is, imagine if I did hit that car, then I might have hurt somebody and that person may end up in hospital, and then I might actually end up in trouble, and then I could end up in jail, and it just unspools.
Hi, this is MindChat, a podcast about mental health by and for young people. I'm Lauren, your host, and today we will be talking about OCD. Joining us on the show, we have Stephanie, a parent sharing her experience of caring for her child living with OCD. We also have Dr Iain Perkes, Clinical Director of Mental Health at Sydney Children's Hospital. Thank you for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
First question, Iain, can you explain what is OCD?
Yeah, so OCD is obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it's all in the name. It's constituted of obsessions and compulsions. About 1 in 50 people have OCD. It occurs across a spectrum of severity. So for some people it is quite mild, but for some people it's really profoundly impactful and really limits their capacity to get to school, to get out to see friends, really to participate in any meaningful way. So obsessions are recurrent intrusive images or thoughts or urges that people may have, and compulsions are typically physical acts that accompany those obsessions, standardly aimed at reducing or preventing the recurrence of those obsessive thoughts.
For parents and carers listening today, can you tell us about the early signs of OCD? What might they notice in their child?
We know from retrospective studies when we ask parents and people with lived experience of OCD to think back that they would recognise certain repetitive behaviours in early childhood, actually around 3 or 4 years of age. Now, that's not necessarily a direct manifestation or expression of OCD necessarily, but it might herald the later development of OCD. So that's something that parents, to borrow a phrase, could perhaps be alert but not alarmed about, and just sort of think on that over time. Certainly if it's getting in the way, again, if it's functionally impactful even at that age, then getting along to see, in the first instance, potentially a general practitioner or a paediatrician to get advice and input, that would be sensible. More typically though, there's 2 ages of onset for OCD, one around 10 or 11 years of age, and then another around 18 to 20 years of age. So these are the sort of peak times of onset of OCD. So the one classic manifestation or symptom type is contamination symptoms. So parents might see their young person, their child, spending more time in the bathroom, washing their hands. They might notice excoriation, so redness on their hands, difficulty getting ready for school or doing homework, where a young person might be repeating things again and again, trying to get them just. So really an extreme type of perfectionism might be one way of thinking about that. But there's also a lot of internalised symptoms with OCD, and there are some symptoms that people feel really ashamed about. I mean, they really shouldn't, but it's easy for me to say. These are taboo type symptoms. So particularly as people get older, so in adolescence, they might experience unwanted sexual images, unwanted violent images, unwanted sort of religious images in their mind, and they might be confused or ashamed by those experiences and not feel able to express those, share those with others, even their parents. So, I think there's some general advice there that, irrespective of OCD or other, if parents are noticing their child is really withdrawn and not their old self, then having curiosity, making space to talk to them about that, and also making space for them to talk to another trusted adult. It might be that the parent's not the right person at that point in time for the young person to share the information with, but there might be an auntie, an uncle, school counsellor, or some other person in their life.
Can you tell us about treatment? Is it better to start the treatment earlier rather than later?
So what we know about most health conditions, and OCD is no different, is that the earlier you treat, the better the outcome. That's as a general principle that's true in healthcare, and certainly it's true in OCD. So getting onto things early is important. Getting access to a good quality assessment and good quality behavioural therapy is really fundamental. There are also some really important foundational elements of treatment, such as education for the young person and the family, so that to avoid to minimise any negative impact on the family function. So OCD can be very challenging for a family system, a lot of challenging symptoms, and sometimes that gets perceived as the young person being challenging or having challenging behaviour themselves. So that education that it's not the young person, it's not their fault, it's the OCD, and rallying the family together against the OCD can be a really important and rapid intervention from a skilled practitioner. Also, again, stepping away from OCD, but it stays with OCD, getting the best sleep that you can, getting really good nutrition is really important, getting good exercise and maintaining social contact. These help with OCD. We think there's enough evidence there to recommend those things, and they're certainly very helpful things to do more broadly, just for healthcare in general and quality of life wellbeing. So those things are fairly incontroversially recommended very early on. Then the specific treatments for OCD is a specific type of behavioural therapy called exposure and response prevention. That is somewhat challenging to access, but it is very important that that modality of treatment be delivered.
There are several online tests. Do I have OCD? How helpful or harmful are they?
Look, I think that going to trusted website, we have a website, so OCD.org.au is a website that people can go to for good information. OCD UK, OCD Action, IOCDF, these are all good websites with good quality information that people can go to read and learn more about OCD. And I think, though, ultimately, if people are thinking that they or someone that they care for has OCD, it's about getting to a trusted health professional and getting that assessed. So in the Australian setting, that's most typically a general practitioner, depending on the circumstance, though.
Do you have any happy stories from your OCD clinic you can share?
The clinic that we've been supported to set up in Sydney Children's Hospital network has been a really powerful experience for most of the young people that come through the clinic. They have a really terrific response. So we're focusing on young people that have either severe to extreme symptoms or have attempted to access treatment elsewhere and haven't had the success that they would have liked. So one young person, for instance, that had 3 previous hospitalisations, had been told that they wouldn't be able to respond to behavioural therapy, and actually when we applied that therapy in a well-resourced setting, that young person had a really fantastic response, was able to return to their studies, to get out and be seeing their friends. So, yeah, very satisfying.
It's really lovely to hear those stories and know that these outcomes are possible for children who are living with OCD. What message would you give to people who have just received a diagnosis, or to parents and carers whose children have just been diagnosed?
Well done on accessing care for yourself or your family member. That in itself is a really important achievement. I think that you should be optimistic and hopeful in terms of the likely treatment outcomes. We know that for more than 2/3 of people, they have a really excellent response to the behavioural therapy, achieving effectively what we would call remission or a full response from treatment. It's important to access really effective therapy, and there are some guidelines for consumers on questions that they can ask to better understand what type of treatment they're getting and whether that is an effective treatment. But there's many effective treatments for OCD, and people should feel hopeful.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. That's really great to hear. And thank you again, Iain, for joining us today.
Lovely to be here, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
We also have joining us today Stephanie, a parent of a young child living with OCD. Thank you for being here, Stephanie.
Hi, Lauren. How are you?
I am well, thank you. How did you first realise that something was different with your child?
So my son was 11 years old, and I noticed that he was withdrawing and he had stomach issues and he became quite depressed. And that was the early signs of his obsessive-compulsive disorder, because what happens with a lot of children who have OCD is that the thoughts are really distressing, and so they are not comfortable to share them with anybody. And I think that if he was to have shared them with me, I wouldn't have thought they were as distressing as they were to him. Yeah.
Did you know anything about OCD before your son's diagnosis?
I didn't know very much about OCD. I thought it was people who washed their hands or had to knock on the table 3 times before they left the house. What I have now learned is that it is has many more different ways that it comes to life. An example of it is I think a lot of people would have this experience where you're driving the car and you think, oh gosh, imagine if I just hit that car next to me. And most people, that thought just goes in and out of your head without a second thought. But for a person with OCD, they will then start to obsess. So the obsession will start, which is, oh, imagine if I did hit that car, then I might have hurt somebody and that person may end up in hospital, and then I might actually end up in trouble, and then I could end up in jail. And it unspools within their head. And that's not something where you're washing your hands. It's something that is inside of your head that nobody can see. And so, yeah, and the compulsions for that aren't external hand washing. They are thoughts that you have that you will self-soothe in order to calm the obsession, at least for a little while, until it pops its head up again.
How was this journey for your son?
OCD is very difficult to diagnose in children because of what I mentioned before around the shame of the thoughts that they are having, and particularly when the obsessions are internalised. It's very difficult to try to get to the bottom of that with the child. So I think for him it was all very confronting and probably confusing. He never described the symptoms to me. It was more as a parent observing and reporting them back to the psychiatrist. And we had a 3-hour initial session with the psychiatrist where he spent time with my son one-on-one asking questions, as well as taking the full family history and asking us about what his behaviours were separate to him, with him, and then with him on his own. So it is, I think the challenge, as Ian mentioned, and as I said, it is just so taboo, these thoughts. It is so hidden within them that they don't want to share it. It's quite difficult to get to the bottom of it.
I can imagine it would be incredibly difficult. Since starting the treatment, have you noticed any changes?
So one of the challenges that Ian alluded to is finding the right support and accessing the right support. I think it would have been really useful for us to have been involved in some family therapy early on, because one of the challenges for families of children who have obsessive-compulsive disorder is, as a parent, you accommodate your child's behaviour. And it is a term that's used in the OCD community where, for example, if your child has a contamination disorder, you will wipe the table down before they sit down so that their symptoms are relieved, because it is incredibly distressing for these children. The thoughts are yelling at them at times in their head, and they won't leave them alone. And when you've seen a child that's had 5 hours in bed being sort of tormented and harassed by these thoughts, as a parent, it's very easy to accommodate. And I'll wipe the table so we can at least get a meal. But that's actually the worst thing that you can do. And I didn't find that out until years after we had been going through various therapies with my son. So, yeah, getting family therapy, finding the right therapist. And I think also making sure that the psychiatrist and the psychologist are in relatively frequent contact, so that the psychiatrist is getting a really good insight on how the child is behaving and how they're responding to the therapy is really critical.
You mentioned the wiping the table example. What were some other things you were recommended to do and not to do?
I think that the hardest thing to learn to do is to not accommodate the obsessions, and it is very hard to push a child that is distressed to continue to push through that level of distress. When I say that, it needs to be done within the context of having the appropriate psychologist and the appropriate exposure response prevention therapy, that the child knows that when we go to dinner tonight, mum won't have wiped the table. That'd be the first step. And the psychologist will set a hierarchy with the child, and the child will work with the psychologist to understand what the lowest step on that hierarchy is. An example is brushing teeth. And I thought the first step would be holding the toothbrush. It can be something even more removed, which is saying the word toothbrush. So you just never know where that person's threshold starts, but as the parent, you have to work with your child and work them through that distress of that most simple level, and then take it up to the next level and the next level and the next level. So it does take a lot of work from the parent, but it does pay off.
So how is your son? How is he doing now?
He is in a better place than he has been for a long time. Yep.
That's really good to hear. I hope it continues to move in that direction for you all. What advice would you give to young people listening today?
Be really kind on yourself and to be really patient. And I know that is so hard when the thoughts are so loud and so persistent. I would recommend, if you possibly can, finding somebody to share what those thoughts are, even if it's writing it down and posting it to the psychologist, whether it's telling a teacher at school. It is really, really helpful and will really ensure that you find the right treatment and the right help when the team around you who are helping you understand exactly what the thoughts are, because it means that they can then tailor the therapy specifically to the challenges that you are and the obsessions that you are managing.
Is there anything you can think of that young people living with OCD could do to support their parents or carers?
Supporting parents is best achieved by, as I said, by sharing what these thoughts are. If you can find that one person that you can tell that can then safely share that with the psychologist and the psychiatrist, your parents don't need to know, actually, at the end of the day, then that will really help your parents, because it means that all of the work they're doing to get the right team around you, that team can then help you to the best of their abilities.
Thank you for sharing that advice. I can imagine how helpful that would be to our listeners today. When you hear people say, "I'm so OCD," how do you feel?
I get really upset. They haven't seen what it is like to be having thoughts that are screaming at you for hours on end that you cannot stop, and you cannot leave your bed, and you are now no longer leaving the house, leaving your room, going to school. You are completely disabled by these thoughts. It can be such an insidious disorder, and it's not as simple as, I need to line up my knives and forks at the table. I think people need to understand more about obsessive-compulsive disorder, but more broadly, I think that the community needs to be more curious and compassionate about mental health disorders in general. Ask the questions, find out how it is for that particular young child and that family. Don't judge, just listen and support.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Stephanie, and for sharing your insights and experience with us. I'm sure it'll be very beneficial not only to the young people listening, but their parents and carers.
Great, thank you.
If this topic has raised anything for you, there's help out there. Talk to your family, friends, school, and tell your GP if you're feeling stressed, anxious, or down. You can call the Mental Health Access Line on 1800 011 511 or go to the Head to Health website, headtohealth.gov.au for services and resources. Thanks for joining us on MindChat, a podcast brought to you by the Sydney Children's Hospitals Network. Until next time, bye for now.